Okay.
Sound great.
So, I was just saying that we have decided on an order in our presentations, and our presentations will start with Noah. Noah has
You muted yourself again.
I don't know how this happens. I was just saying that Noah will start our presentations. He has some slides to share. Andrea, if you'd be kind enough to start the share, or we can also do it on our end. But I know you said that you have it and it's ready to go. So we'll start with our first presentation by Noah Golden. And Noah, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Andrea, is it easier for me to present my own slides, or? I'll present my own slides just to make it for us. Let me just.
Oh, I'm just removing your spotlight, or removing two spotlights so that you can be seen. Is that okay? Well, or do you prefer? I have them right here.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine if that works.
All right, here
Okay.
we go. Oh, shoot.
So thank you for your patience this morning as we navigate all of the technical challenges. It is so important that we come together throughout the Americas and beyond to be able to talk about the importance of critical media literacy in education. And of course, as we come together from all of our various sites and spaces, there are bound to be technical challenges. So thank you again for your patience as we navigate these. I want to begin our conversation today thinking about the challenges of doing critical media literacy in teacher education. The state in which I work, California, both the most populous state in the United States and also a state often considered to be the most progressive. There is a saying here that as goes California, goes the country. Many policy initiatives oftentimes start in this state. And yet, when it comes to things like critical media literacy, we are very far behind. Let's see, it's not allowing me to share screen now.
Okay. I got it. I'm doing it right now.
It's working from
there. Okay.
Wonderful. So if you look at the standards in California, this very progressive state, you see every time anything related to media being shared is in a very reductive skills-only way. There's a complete lack of criticality, right? So these are the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, the CTC standards here in this state. And I want to argue that these act as a form of governmentality, shaping what is possible or easy to do within teacher education. So our first one, candidates learn the importance of supporting students to use technology, keyboarding, and multimedia as appropriate. Our teacher education programs include digital text and multimedia. The focus is on enhancing language development with digital and multimedia texts, and teacher candidates explore how to use these digital and visual displays to effectively express themselves. The focus here is completely on competencies that lack any form of criticality. It's only about expression. It's only about being able to focus on language development and a decidedly apolitical, uncritical communication. This is the problem that shapes so much of teacher education, because we know that standards are often what are assessed and evaluated in teacher education and K-12 and P-16 education. And this makes it very difficult for many teacher educators, myself included, to add on to do the critical media literacy that we all know is so vital. Now, of course, there are and have been positive developments here in the States. For example, in Los Angeles, the second largest school district, Los Angeles Unified School District, unanimously in 2021 approved a resolution to include critical media literacy in secondary level classrooms. That's something that is a really positive development that many people in the local communities pushed for and worked for, and yet our teacher education programs aren't set up to really be preparing teachers to do this work. The state of Illinois has pushed for critical media literacy to be a requirement in a way that the state of California, often considered, as I mentioned a moment ago, to be progressive, to be on the front lines of educational policy, has not. So there are these positive developments in many local municipalities, but we have so much work to do in the context in which I work here in the state of California. The teacher education program in which I work is the largest in-person teacher education program at the secondary level in the state. And we are doing precious little around critical media literacy. Many of us are trying to infuse this work into our courses, and I want to talk about what we are doing, while I also talk about efforts to bridge this work and broaden this work to make sure we do it at a larger space. So I have the honor of teaching our secondary STEM teachers and doing a literacy course that ends up becoming a jam-packed course with disciplinary literacies, critical literacies, strategies to support emergent bilingual and multilingual students. All of this ends up being in one course, which any educator knows is far too much for a course to be able to do with the depth that students need. So of the 15 times this course meets, and I'm in no way suggesting that this is sufficient, we're able to spend an entire session dedicated to critical media literacy with a focus on what Alan Luke has called regrounding critical literacy, which I've talked about before here in this space with critical media literacy of the Americas. The focus of Alan Luke's work is the notion that students need the disciplinary literacies of the sciences, of mathematics, of other STEM fields in order to assess claims made in texts, whether those are social media texts, print texts, what have you. And it's a way of connecting criticality with empirical investigations, with inductive reasoning. And I think that work is really vital. So in this, we really focus on something that is often the entry point, but shouldn't be the ending point of critical media literacies here in the States in this context, which is how do we ascertain the claims being made? Namely, is this true? Is this verifiable? So in this work, we focus on the disciplinary STEM literacies, and we talk about the digital ethics of posting, reposting, and how we engage with media texts that we interact with on a daily basis in our media-saturated society. So the focus is on both critical consumption and production of media. So we also then move from this into a unit planning project where the future teachers who are my students begin with the Sustainable Developmental Goals of the United Nations to talk about real world challenges. And then they dive into information, misinformation, and the role of their disciplinary communities, whether it's physics or calculus or what have you, to be able to give students tools to both navigate the information, misinformation, and disinformation they may come across about these real world challenges and what we can do about them, and to think about how we might encourage students to be local change agents and decision makers as they work on a local project partnered with a community-based organization through this unit that they design that is going to come up with ideas to improve something like a lack of access to, say, potable drinking water in a local community. So they design, as I was just saying, an overview of this multidisciplinary project to engage disciplinary learning, investigations, and youth decision-making on issues that matter, right? And again, taking into account misinformation and disinformation. So some examples, because of the horrific responses here in the US to the pandemic protocols and all of the misinformation and disinformation around the COVID-19 pandemic, one group of science and math educators wanted to have students identify what they would want to be the protocols in their state for our next pandemic. And this relates to the Sustainable Developmental Goal of ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages. And so the students were involved in disciplinary literacies, but also a critical media literacy to be able to encourage folks to think about the information and misinformation and disinformation they come across. Another group of my students designed a unit around what does it mean to have sustainable transportation to and from school to connect with the funds of knowledge and lived realities of students who often have to commute very far to get to a school where they have access to an education that is allowing them to achieve greater excellence in their own academic work. And this, of course, connects with a sustainable developmental goal around making humans settlements and cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So these are some of the things that I'm trying to work in, but what we really need is an entire course dedicated to critical media literacy. And in a program that is focused on meeting the requirements of the California Teacher Credentialing Agency, what we end up doing is meeting exactly those requirements. So many of us are starting to think about how do we work for change at a broader level in the state of California. So I and others involved in the critical media literacy of the Americas community, namely Jeff Scher, who is a leader and whose work inspires so many of us, are involved with E.P.E.S, a program run out of the University of California at Irvine that's focused on environmental and climate change literacy projects. And one of the foci here is really around storytelling. And so the focus is on critical media production to think about how we encourage teachers and their students in the future to be able to tell the stories that need to be told, to center on voices that are being pushed to the margins, to think about positionalities with how people are experiencing climate crisis and working to mitigate the worst effects of climate while trying to change policies here in the States, to foster inquiry and possibly reframe school. And one of the things we're discussing in this statewide initiative is how do we, or is it worthwhile to add new requirements to the teacher education policies so that all teacher candidates are doing work around climate activism, which involves a lot of work on critical media literacy, specifically critical media production. And finally, I'll share, I'm also involved in efforts at the state level with what's known as the Center for Advancement of Reading and Writing, or CARW, and we're putting together resource toolkits because one of the challenges we often find in this work is that even when policy shifts, we haven't yet built capacity for teacher educators and their students to begin doing this work right away. So while we're pushing in one organization for a policy shift, in this organization, we're building up resources and creating opportunities for teachers to learn more about how to do critical media literacy and critical literacies in general, so that when policies do shift, we're ready to take advantage of those policies. So I want to stop now to make sure we have time for my other colleagues. And I look forward to the dialogue that I hope will come. And thank you so much for your patience with our tech challenges this morning. I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Noah. That was a really good representation of what is going on and how you are able to, challenge some of those statewide and local limitations that we have in teaching critical media literacy. And now, to expand this conversation, I will introduce Neil, who will give us an overview of what he's working on and the challenges that he has faced teaching critical media literacy in the context of Canada.
I cannot really speak for Canada. Like the United States, education changes from province to province in Canada as it does from state to state in the United States. So I really can only speak for Ontario. Similar to Noah's situation, however, Ontario is the largest province and therefore tends to have a fair bit of influence Canada-wide. We have been an organization for over 40 years. We were lucky enough to get media literacy put into the curriculum, starting in actually 1979, mandated in 1989. So it was in the curriculum as a recommendation, and then mandated in as of 1989. We have a new curriculum that has just emerged this summer, and it isn't good news. Similar to what Noah was suggesting, it has very much a vocational and a protectionist bent to it, and very, very little in terms of critical thinking. So that saddens us. And when we poll teachers that we do workshops for, we discovered they're having little or no media literacy education in their pre-service, which again saddens us because this is something so important. Media literacy on its own, notwithstanding critical media literacy, which should always also be there. But that being said, the Association for Media Literacy and the direction that it takes in media literacy education includes critical media literacy and has done from the very beginning. Our philosophies were based on UK and Australian media literacy educators, and we have placed values and social and political effects foregrounded in our studies. And so from the very beginning, we are always talking about those power relationships and the people who are holding the power and the people who are not. The other thing that we have done specifically is to ground our media literacy education in the ideas of Marshall McLuhan. And I mentioned that because I don't see that happening in many other jurisdictions. So we find that's really useful. It's a great way of entering into the whole relationship that we have with media. But McLuhan wasn't particularly interested in critical media literacy. And so we've had to expand his ideas with ideas from Derrida and Foucault, and especially Gramsci, because the notion of hegemony is so important in critical media literacy. So we make a special point of looking at hegemony. I would like, however, to talk a little bit about the social climate in Canada, and this is Canadian-wide. We have had a number of years ago a Royal Commission on the status of our Indigenous people. That Royal Commission came up with 19 recommendations, and most of those recommendations were critical media literacy focused because they had to do with the power relationships between the mainstream society and the Indigenous society. And so that has had some really interesting effects generally. And I mean this in terms of the environment of all Canadians. And what has happened is that social justice has been more on our minds as a result of the Royal Commission and some of the follow-up events that have occurred. So people probably don't know that Canada had residential schools. And the idea behind the residential school was to educate the Indigenous population so that they could become gainfully employed. The way, however, that they initiated or set that up was very destructive to the Indigenous culture. Specifically, children were removed from their families at a relatively young age and placed in residential schools. Some of them never went home again, and some of them were able to go home on school breaks. The fallout from this has been termed cultural genocide because the people that were running the schools were Catholics and Episcopalians predominantly, with a few other Christian religions thrown in. And so there was a great deal of Christian ideology forced upon these children, and some very violent things in terms of cutting their hair and changing their clothing to try to civilize, and there are air quotes there, civilize those people. Those people were also sufficiently unhappy with that general loneliness and abuse that many of them died. And I could say died in captivity. I'm sure that that's not the word that they would have chosen. But the interesting thing now is that these residential schools, and by the way, the last one only closed in the 1990s. So I'm not talking about ancient history. And so these wounds are quite fresh. We have many, many people whose stories include their experiences in residential schools. And I can't say there were 2 or 3. There were about 35 or 36 of them around. And so that's a lot of people and a lot of schools and a lot of abuse. But what has happened more recently is even more interesting in terms of social justice. And that is that at regular but erratic intervals, people have been discussing discovering unmarked graves on the grounds of these residential schools. And the only conclusion we're coming to is that some children were maybe killed or some children died, and they were just buried in unmarked graves, and their families were notified that they were gone. And now, because these lands are more public and more accessible, they are finding unmarked grave sites. When this happens, it's in the national news. It's a news story. And you never know when it's going to happen. If you know about random, you know that random is the most powerful form of reward and conversation. So at random intervals, another residential school in another part of Canada discovers it has unmarked graves. And this constantly foregrounds the whole social justice conversation. There's something else that has done it too, and I'm wandering here a little bit, but this is, I think, a fit. This is a Canadian $10 bill, and this person on our $10 bill is Norma Desmond. Sorry, Viola Desmond. Pardon me. Viola Desmond was a businesswoman in Eastern Canada who went to a movie theater and sat on the main floor and was told by an usher that she couldn't sit there because she was Black and had to move to the balcony. She refused. She was arrested. She was charged. And her civil disobedience has become famous enough that we wanted to make that an important moment in history. And so every time we use a $10 bill, we see Viola Davis on that $10 bill. She replaced one of our former prime ministers, which is also a good thing because that former prime minister has now been accused of prejudice against our Indigenous peoples while he was the prime minister. And so we have another set of things that I think are foregrounding social justice, and that has to do with naming. And so that prime minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, has a highway and schools and other institutions named after him, just as there's a Barack Obama high school someplace. And there are others in addition to him who have just in the last 2 or 3 years been completely disgraced, so much to the point that one of these people, a man named Ryerson, whose name was on a university, has had that name removed from the university, and the university has had to choose a new name. Those events continue to foreground social justice issues. And so Canadians are reminded of social justice through their newscasts and through these other events on a constant basis. And it gives teachers a real opportunity because they can talk about, okay, why has this statue been removed, or why has this school or highway been challenged in its name, and why has this university actually changed its name, and is that the correct way to go, or other ways we should do that? And who might be in office right now who is committing social justice violations that we should know about? And so, as I said, this continues to remain in the foreground of the public conversation. And I think that's a great thing. And it gives teachers wonderful opportunities because they're not just talking about history, which is important, but they can also be talking about current events. And so they can see the whole breadth of our history. We're a younger country than the United States, just over 150 years, but we have lots to talk about and much history that we are actually making just now. I'm ready to pass it on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noah and Neil. And I think, Neil, as I was listening to your presentation, I'm reminded of how this is very much a question of politics of representation, the struggle for the power to represent, to frame and to connote a meaning. And, we have representations that are prevailing and then there are also, you know, competing representations. And so it's interesting how the choices in language, image, audio, you know, people and events can render sociocultural, you know, textual analysis. And I think this is definitely the wider scope of critical media literacy work that we're doing. I would like to only take a few minutes because I want to give our audiences the time to ask questions. I will talk about the class that I teach at UCLA, and the teacher education program at UCLA is truly exemplary in the way that we have managed to create a standalone class that teaches critical media literacy for, you know, in its entirety. So for an entire course, it's just dedicated to critical media literacy, and I teach the STEM cohort. And just very briefly, the class is divided. The course is divided into 4 focal points, and we begin with an introduction to media literacy, and we advance to critical. So we begin with visual literacy. What is visual literacy? And technological competency. And then from there, once our students work with creating and understanding the visual language and the technical competency of taking pictures, creating a podcast, or, you know, creating a meme, then we advance to discussions of social and digital media, science ideology, you know, politics of representation. Those would be the core foundational frameworks of the course. And I'll just take a few minutes to discuss science ideology, which is something that I am fascinated by, and the connections between you know, science and critical media literacy. You know, in teaching this course, I've come to learn that STEM teachers have had very little academic engagement and robust discussions about science and ideology. It is hard to dismiss technological innovation in events or processes such as militarism, environmental destruction, you know, and free market competitiveness. And, you know, ideology guides what scientific problems, methods, hypotheses, and set of interpretations need attention and investigation. So science, ideology, you know, has served different needs under different ideological regimes. And that's something that, you know, hasn't been discussed in any of my students' science education courses. So that's something that I emphasize in our class. In our class discussions, we cross-examine notions such as scientific globalism, scientific innovation, international collaboration as they relate to transnational corporations, you know, economic competitiveness, a lot of, you know, exploitation of natural resources in developing countries. And so the classes focuses on all aspects of science through ideology. You know, we basically do a lot of critical discourse analysis in the class to understand the role of science and scientific inquiry situated in social and civic life that addresses local needs. We discuss how the absence of women and people of color in scientific research has influenced the selection of scientific problems, right? The methods, interpretations, and so, you know, and we discuss how historically, you know, the absence of women and people of color has has created notions about who has authority and legitimacy to create knowledge. So that's just wanted to focus a little more on that, on science and ideology as a core foundation in the course. But we only have 10 minutes, so I want to end here, and you can feel free to ask me about how I teach my class that is unique, and it's in I think across the United States there are probably 5 teacher education programs that give as much time, attention to critical media literacy as the one that I teach in. So I will end here, and I would like to open this discussion for our audiences to ask questions to Noah, Neil, and myself. And what I would like to suggest is you can either raise your hand in the bar, or if no one is speaking, you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
I'll start. I have a question about, you all kind of alluded to the production element for your learners. Could any of you speak more to the type of projects that you do with that have that critical media literacy focus as far as student production?
Okay, I will. I can speak to that. I think that was Scott's voice, if I'm not mistaken. So
Yes.
yeah, wonderful. So the production piece, there is quite a bit of production, and that we do in our class. And so from the beginning, we do a lot of, so I'll go over maybe 2 or 3. So we do a podcast assignment where they create a podcast episode, and usually assign a topic that is relevant to what they're teaching. And then another production piece is it's very, we use multiple productions in the class. The digital storytelling project, where students create a counter narrative story, and we'll look at professional examples of such stories, and students will create an alternative digital story. And this one is normally always related to environmental justice. So if they're teaching biology, if they're teaching chemistry, if they're teaching math, they take a math problem and create a word problem, for example, and then they convert the word problem that is social justice related into a digital problem. So then they create that math problem into a digital narrative story. That's another example. Memes are a great way of communicating a lot of content visually, and can be very critical. So meme creation is also very creative expressions of content that they teach. Again, it could be in biology, looking at race, from a biological, cultural point, and then expressing that through a meme. So these are some examples of production. And I know, Noah, you also use, if you want to share other examples.
Well, we certainly don't do enough, right? One of the things that we're working on is as we revamp our master's program, because the program I teach is specifically a credential program that's post-baccalaureate, but isn't a master's. Everything is very rushed and it's all aligned with what the CTC is saying we need to do, the credentialing agency. And so we talk a lot. We don't practice what we preach, which is the problem. We talk a lot about having students using various media to produce for their students to produce responses to projects that are being designed, and yet we're still stuck in this kind of unimodal, writing papers about explaining unit plans and what have you. And so we really need to go through more of a transformation. Things we do talk about for, say, a social science history teacher would be to do a project in which students will read 4 different textbook chapters that purport to represent the events of a particular historical period, and then invite students to write their own chapter for what do you think needs to be included or not included. So to engage in the politics of representation in that way after doing empirical investigations according to that discipline. So that's work that we talk a lot about, but we're fighting now to create the space to do actual critical media production and analysis in teacher ed courses, which it is a hard sell with the parameters within which we work right now. So I think that we'll be able to eventually do that in the master's program, but I want to collectively think through how do we do that in just teacher education, because so many of our teachers aren't even doing, the master's, at least not at this stage. Neil, do you have things you want to share from the perspective of Ontario?
Neil, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you've covered the production ideas well. I would like to, however, really speak to production, because production is a great way to engage critical thinking. If I go into a production mode, I put my students' brains into a different position. They have to make a lot of creative and critical thinking. And so it's a natural mental atmosphere to get them into. And so whichever of those, whether you do the podcast or the other things that have been mentioned, they are great ways of engaging. And that's something that David Gauntlet is doing here in Toronto, because he's very, very interested in creativity. And creativity is, if it isn't supporting critical thinking, it's synonymous in some cases with critical thinking. So I just want to promote that.
Yeah, and I'll just like to add that the reason that my class starts with emphasizing technological competency in the beginning is so that we can get into that producing. So it's not enough to just, be critical of content that we see, but we also need to produce alternative narratives. And in order to do that, we start with the basics, which is the visual language, the visual literacy, learning the visual language, the technical competency, and then further advancing into the critical aspects. So yes, that's critically important to have, as part of that whole critical media literacy discipline, to have that technical literacy available to students. Any other questions? I'm gonna check the chat. You may also write questions in the chat. Andrea has a question for us.
Oh, I was elaborating on Scott. That was actually a very similar question to my own. But I'm very excited to continue to learn from you all three, as I know we all are, and appreciate how you each highlighted different areas that we can be thinking about, and especially highlighting various aspects of why it is so significant as we're thinking about the next generation of teachers and the ways that we're educating and preparing future educators with different aspects of critical media literacy. So any other further questions? We have time for one more, and then we gotta open the space back up for the next session. Go ahead, Raul. Thank you.
Yeah, I had to jump in. First of all, thank you, Tatvek, and of course, my main man Noah. Always good to hear your thoughts. You got to hear my brother. You know that. My question has to do with one issue that I've been noticing, that there are a lot of stories about these efforts to promote critical media literacy and all this that are happening at the teacher education. Now, yet we hardly get to hear what happens once our teachers go into schools. We really, there's a disconnect between the narratives of what happens in teacher ed and what's happening once our teachers go into schools. So either it's because they're not being able to enact them, or because they're not being able to tell the stories. So the question here is, what has your impression been so far? And if the answer is the second one, then what should we do from the teacher education side to advocate for these teachers to get their voices heard once and for all?
What an important question, Raul. Thank you for asking. The challenge is many of us are working in large underfunded institutions that kind of have a check mark when students get to where they need to get with the bare minimum, just like the K-12 system and oftentimes the P-16 system as a whole. And we aren't doing that follow-up. Sometimes we struggle to even have really meaningful exit surveys or follow-up surveys. So one of the things we're talking about at my institution is creating inquiry-based teacher activist groups where we work with our former teacher candidates and their mentor teachers to talk about how we're bridging what we're doing in the credentialing program and what they're experiencing in school communities. And critical media literacy is a right possibility for the center of that work, with pushing schools to adopt to new technologies, new literacies, and the criticality that is often missing in our skills-based ways of evaluating, assessing, so on and so forth. So we're trying to find ways to bridge those spaces. And the challenge is always funding, time, and all of the other forms of governmentality that shape our work. I don't know if Tatvek and Neil have thoughts.
So Jeff Scher and I, a few years ago, did a study where we went back a few years and contacted all the students who had taken the critical media literacy course, and surveyed how they have been able to integrate, how well, how often, how frequently they have been integrating the concepts that they learned. And we were pleased to hear that many of them were doing the work in their classrooms, and they found that doing the critical media literacy work engage students academically in their classrooms. So that was a great finding. But like you said, Noah, we're not doing enough to be a continued support system for our students who get out from our programs. And as many of them first-time teachers, it is very difficult unless they have this kind of disposition towards seeing the world from a critical media perspective lens, where everything is informed, all their classroom content is informed by it. You're only going to have teachers who bring in critical media sporadically in their curriculum. So I think one of the main concepts is to create this, to instill that theoretical commitment that all our work is informed from this framework, in order for our teachers, when they leave the program,